ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Shocking evidence, jury drama and witness cross-examinations. The Mushroom Case Daily podcast took you inside one extraordinary trial. And now we're back with The Case Of, where we report the in-depth detail of how Australian criminal courts work and who's in there each week. And we're starting with the case of the Croc Wrangler, Matt Wright.
Mr. Wright denies any wrongdoing.
To hear more, search for the new podcast, The Case Of. It's on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Since the terrible events of October 7, 2023, we have witnessed a number of appalling anti-Semitic attacks against Australia's Jewish community. ASIO has now gathered enough credible intelligence to reach a deeply disturbing conclusion that the Iranian government directed at least 2 of these attacks.
It was an extraordinary announcement. Flanked by senior ministers and the nation's spy chief, the Prime Minister revealed Iran had directed at least 2 anti-Semitic attacks in Australia last year.
These were extraordinary and dangerous acts of aggression orchestrated by a foreign nation on Australian soil.
And now we've cut all ties with Tehran.
We have declared Iran's ambassador to Australia persona non grata, as well as 3 other Iranian officials, and they will have 7 days to leave the country. The government has now taken the step to withdraw our ambassador to Iran, and we have suspended the operations of our embassy in Iran for the safety of our officials and Australia's border security.
Today, terrorism expert Greg Barton on what we know and what Iran was hoping to achieve. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Greg, last year we saw a number of anti-Semitic attacks in Australia. It really was a terrible time for the Jewish community here, wasn't it?
It was. It was shocking because not only did we have incidents where it was property damage, one synagogue was burnt out, but it could very easily have been loss of life. We came so close to something really tragic, and that was really concerning.
Now we've had this extraordinary press conference in Canberra, led by the Prime Minister, where he's revealed that ASIO has confirmed that Iran was behind 2 attacks.
Iran has sought to disguise its involvement, but ASIO assesses it was behind the attacks on the Lewis Continental Kitchen in Sydney on October 20 last year, and the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne on December 6 last year. ASIO assesses it is likely Iran directed further attacks as well.
What do we know?
Well, it's a shocking revelation, but it's also not a surprising revelation. It's not the sort of thing you'd dare speculate without evidence, and ASIO clearly has really clear evidence. But we do know that Iran has a long history of running black operations, intelligence operations, often out of embassies and consulates. The worst case scenarios involves assassination, but also influence operations. This is in the context of information warfare. So they were clearly trying to, on a low budget with sort of modest means, cause trouble for Australia. ASIO was likely sensing this as a possibility for a long time. Now we get a sense of what obviously has been seen behind the scenes for a long time, that there's clear evidence that Iran was running an operation to try and interfere with Australian politics, interfere with the Australian political process.
Yeah, so in response to this, the Iranian ambassador to Australia has been expelled and Australia's embassy in Tehran has been closed. The Prime Minister says the staff there were safely removed to a third country, but it's a big logistical move, isn't it? It's pretty tricky.
It's extremely fraught because you don't want to reveal your hand and you've got everything in place, but then there's a period of time when you're trying to move people out, and with Iran, we've got a long history of people being falsely arrested, falsely charged and held really as pawns, as hostages for some sort of diplomatic currency. And that could easily have happened in this transition moment. So thankfully we're through that.
Well, the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, she's warning Australians against travelling to Iran.
I do know that many Australians have family connections in Iran. But I urge any Australian who might be considering travelling to Iran, please do not do so. Our message is, if you are an Australian in Iran, leave now if it is safe to do so.
The government has also listed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a branch of the Iranian military, as a terrorist organisation. Minister Tony Burke, he indicated that that would happen immediately.
The government intends to introduce a new regime under the Criminal Code so that we can list the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This sends the strongest possible signal that this conduct has reached a new and totally unacceptable low.
Is that quite significant? Are there other nations that have listed that corps as a terrorist group?
Well, it's a big call because the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps is essentially it is the regime for all intents and purposes. It runs the economy, it runs obviously the military. It began life as a branch of the military. As a result of the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran after the revolution, this Revolutionary Guards Corps really came to seize the reins of power and have been in power ever since. There's some degree of power sharing, but essentially to declare that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps is a terrorist group is to say that the regime running Iran is a terrorist group. That's a big call. Most nations haven't gone that far because the problem with making this call is you close off diplomatic contacts. You by definition, legally can't speak to terrorists and negotiate with them. And so people have been reluctant to go this far, but this is clearly, we've come to a tipping point where this has to be done.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister and the head of ASIO say that the Iranian regime, it could have been involved in more than the 2 attacks that they've identified so far.
ASIO is still investigating possible Iranian involvement in a number of other attacks, but I want to stress we do not believe the regime is responsible for every act of anti-Semitism in Australia.
And of course, there was a string of attacks, wasn't there, last year? Antisemitic attacks, mainly in Sydney and Melbourne, but it was horrifying.
It was horrifying, and yet at the same time, these attacks didn't seem to fit the pattern of a groundswell of grassroots protest, but rather some odd actors. And when people were arrested, often the only connections were criminal connections. So in other words, they seem to be doing it for hire, which begs the question, who would hire them? Now it begins to become clearer. The good news in Australia is we don't have a situation with grassroots spontaneous violence. We do have a serious problem with anti-Semitism, but the more serious attacks on synagogues and MPs' offices and so forth, it now appears we're not the public just acting out of anger, but rather somebody trying to orchestrate trouble.
Incredible. All right, well, some people have actually already appeared in court in relation to these offences. The ASIO boss made it clear they were paid.
There is an organised crime element offshore in this, but that's not to suggest organised crime are doing it. They're just using cutouts, including people who are criminal and members of organised crime gangs, to do their bidding or direct their bidding in Australia. But
he describes Iran's involvement as a layer cake of cutouts.
Yeah, it makes it hard to prove. You can arrest somebody, they may admit in court they were paid, but what does that tell you about who ultimately higher up the chain hired them and authorised the payments? That's, I think, what his head of ASIO is referring to. Iran is good at what they do, so they make it hard to form definitive links, even if intelligence agencies are convinced they've got those links.
All right, well, Greg, let's have a look then at what Iran was actually trying to achieve. These sorts of attacks, they really did go to social cohesion in Australia. They tore, Mike Burgess says, at our social fabric.
it goes without saying, Iran's actions are utterly unacceptable. They put lives at risk, they terrified the community, and they tore at our social fabric. Iran and its proxies literally and figuratively lit the matches and fanned the flames.
We know that the Jewish community is traumatised because of the October 7 Hamas terror attacks in 2023. And, Israel is a small country, so people have personal, immediate connections. but then traumatized by the rising anti-Semitism. At the same time, the world looked on at what was happening in Gaza and was also justifiably traumatized and upset and saying, why don't we do something? So very febrile and very potentially unstable situation. I think Australia's shown that the base level of social cohesion has held us in good stead. But these sort of deliberate attacks to try and weaken that, to cut away the foundations, if they'd persisted long enough, we could have had loss of life and then things could have escalated very badly. So I think it's one of these moments when we look back and say, thank heavens it wasn't very much worse, but now we can understand what didn't seem logical at the time.
But what's Iran's aim? Is it purely that, to create social unrest, and what does it get out of it?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask what it gets out of it, because it can create the social unrest. It can sow seeds of lack of trust in our government agencies and lack of confidence in elected officials. But where's the benefit to Iran? And this seems to be, Iran is in a difficult position. Its economy is really suffering from imposition of restrictions on trade. They're sort of slowly declining. It's clear that they've been penetrated thoroughly by the Israelis when it comes to defence. So the recent attacks in middle of this year, so they're demoralised. I think the regime is always concerned about one thing above everything else, and that is regime survival. So I think trying to create a sense to their domestic public that actually, the world is the problem, that we're victims of a system that's unjust towards us. You sort of think, well, what has Australia got to do with that? But it's not just Australia. They're doing this around the world. So Australia, we're a middle-sized country. We're a significant democracy. We've taken some clear positions, speaking critically on what's happening in Israel and Palestine, as we should. And I think Iran saw us as being an influential player to get at. But they're doing this around the world. So I think we'll hear more stories of other places, Canada, UK, US, etc. But I think it's, my speculative interpretation is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps regime thought they would get some degree of domestic support by creating a situation in which it looked as if the world was unfairly targeting Iran and blaming it for everything that was happening.
So how damaging then is it for Iran that these revelations have now come out in public?
Well, it would be really devastating if Iran was in good standing, but it's become so much a pariah state that, perhaps the question is how much lower can they go? But it does sort of knock them back down in terms of trust. We would hope to see negotiations over the nuclear program occurring now. Maybe they will still occur because that's still a good option for the regime, given the other options that are much worse. But the level of trust is going to be so low that it just makes it hard to get those sort of things happening. I think it's sort of not a surprise for those who've been paying attention, but it is a surprise for those who suddenly wake up and the news is led with this story. And that isn't really in Iran's interest. And of course, we need to make the caveat that we're not talking about the Iranian people. We're talking about this really nasty Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, almost organised criminal network that runs the country for their own interest, for their own profit. And the people of Iran are victims like everyone else.
All right, well, Greg, we haven't taken action like this against a nation since the Second World War. Do you think it's the right one by Australia to actually cut all ties at this point?
It is the sort of option you take as the very last measure, so with great reluctance. And in ordinary times, of course, the elephant in the room is that in ordinary times we'd be consulting very closely with Washington and trying to coordinate. But we've got a strange moment now where obviously, America is important to us, but there's not the same level of confidence and trust in this second Trump administration. So it's an even riskier move to go and make this definitive sort of cutting of ties. But the evidence must be so overwhelming that there are no other better options, that we've sort of hit rock bottom with the relationship with the regime. I would assume, though, that even if we can't be as confident as we have in the past with our interlocutors in Washington, that there's been a lot of conversations across the rest of the Five Eyes partners, the UK, Canada particularly, and across Europe, and that there's a coordination behind this, that it's not just Australia going it alone and doing something which is, pretty unprecedented.
Now, what are the implications of this, do you think? How will Iran respond, if at all?
Well, Iran will respond with great huff and puff and drama, and they'll try and spin it for domestic benefit by saying it's more signs that they're a victim. But they don't have many good options. This just makes it harder, particularly if as we speculate, if this is not just Australia coming to a difficult decision by itself, but there's a coordinated international response, then this just tightens things up for Iran. It might actually help with forcing the regime to recognise the needs to negotiate on the nuclear program. But, that would be a great outcome if that could occur, but it is going to make it very much harder for them, and they will protest and bluff and bluster. Their intelligence apparatus is completely penetrated. The domestic security as a result is compromised. The Israeli military can fly over their airspace at will. The one thing they can fight back with is information warfare, and that's what they'll be doing.
Greg Barton is a professor of Global Islamic Politics at Deakin University. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.